Hello everyone, this is a continuation of our tutorial on creating feathers using Ornatrix for Maya. In the previous tutorial we created a single feather using the propagation operator and including some of the Ornatrix operators to define its shape, to introduce some clumping and some curvature, as well as other effects that you might want on your feather. So in this follow-up tutorial we're going to be looking at putting that feather, or rather a set of feathers, onto a actual character. So in this case we have our bird here, and our bird is completely naked, so it doesn't have the lead feathers here, the main ones, and it also doesn't have the secondary one. So for now, at first, we're just going to be concentrating on putting the main feathers, so the long ones. In fact, this sample scene, this starting scene, which is available for free on our website in the samples area, contains a set of feathers that were created for this bird initially. If you go to the channel box layers editor, you can find a couple of layers here, and one of them is hidden. It's called feather cards. If you unhide it, you can see those meshes that were created. And all of these are just textured mesh planes. You can actually see the alpha transparency here. If you open the outliner, you can find those feather cards here, and as you can see, they're individual feather meshes, which is not ideal. It's kind of a nightmare to create those by hand, especially having to place them one by one onto your character. And this being not a real feather kind of makes this approach not very ideal for a detailed hero character feathering. So we're going to be creating a similar type of effect of placing these main feathers onto our character, but we're going to do it completely or almost completely procedurally using Ornatrix, and the feathers are going to be very detailed individual hairs, completely created from scratch using the previous and this tutorial. So it's going to be procedural, nice looking, and renderable using any popular renderer out there. So let me just hide this back, so just to show you that there are feather on the tail as well. Let me just hide this layer and we can begin our tutorial. So before we move any further, let's take a look at some reference, which is always a good idea to do when you're trying to model and replicate real life. So in this case, the eagle that I googled here has a pretty good shot of the wing that we can take a look at, and there are a couple of things we can notice right away. So first of all is there are multiple layers of feathers and they seem to be going on top of each other. Second is that this one layer in particular seems to have the longest feathers and is the most prominent. And third is that these feathers are more or less evenly spaced from one another. So we don't want them to be random, we want them to be pretty uniformly spaced towards each other. Also, the feathers at the tips here seem to be a little bit different from the feathers that are closer to the body. And this only applies to this main one. The secondary and third layers are more or less similar feathers here. So for now, let's just try to replicate this very first layer of feathers and see what it takes to do this. Because once we get this done, getting the secondary and the third layers and so on are pretty much straightforward and is more or less a copy and paste type of job. So let's go back to our scene. And we want to place the primary feathers somewhere around the very inner edge of the wing here. To do this, I'm gonna go and enter the component mode of my feather mesh, of my eagle mesh, and I'm gonna go select edge. And it's probably a good idea to turn off the soft select first, so I'm going to do that. It's pretty easily done by pressing the B key on your keyboard, and then I'm going to find the exact area where I want my my feathers to grow, and I'm going to select the very leftmost part of this range. And I'm gonna just kind of trace it with my mouse so I can select this whole edge ring going along all the way to the tip of the wing. Once I find the other edge on the other side of the wing, I'm gonna press Shift to include and then double click to select this whole edge ring over here. Next, I'm going to go into my select menu, convert selection, and I'm going to convert my edge selection into the face component selection. So I'm gonna press to faces just so that we select this whole edge ring as a set of faces. Now I'm gonna go to my Ornatrix menu and add some hairs to this. Initially there is nothing added because the selected faces area is so narrow that there are no guides placed on it. In fact, there's only one guide. But this is not a problem because we're going to be placing our guides manually. So in fact, I'm going to go back to guide from mesh and I'm going to reduce the count all the way to 0. We don't need to automatically generate guides. We will plant manual ones. Then I'm going to go into my edit guides operator and I'm going to enter the root mode. Then I'm going to press the plant guide tool button, and inside the tools menu I'm going to change the length of my placed guides to something like 10 centimeters, because 50 centimeters is too long by default. I'm going to close my window here, and then I'm just going to place my guide here. So one guide here, one guide maybe here, one guide here. You should not stress too much about the placement or the quantity of the guides, because we can always create or delete these guides in the future. I'm going to go to my hair from guides operator, turn it back on, and now I'm going to go and change the interpolation mode to barycentric, and I'm going to change the triangulation type to manual triangulation. So right now there are only 3 hairs generated, and this is fine. We're only previewing 10% of them. If I increase this count, you can see that there are more hairs. But the problem again is, if you look at the reference, we have these feathers evenly spaced, and we want them to be evenly spaced here as well. So if you have watched the previous tutorial about the UV-based distribution, you can get an idea of how we can accomplish this. First, I'm going to change my distribution type to uniform, and I'm also going to increase my render count a bit. And this is better, but if we look this way, you can see that we have like patches of hairs generated. They're not all generated along the same line, and the reason for that is because the UV coordinates are kind of warped along the y-axis, along the v-axis, and they're not exactly straight. And we can correct this by doing a couple of steps. So first step is we probably want a separate UV channel for our mesh. I'm gonna go to UV menu and open the UV set editor. Next, I'm going to copy my UV channel 1, so we have a separate channel just for the hairs. I'm going to rename it to hair distribution. Next, I'm going to go to my hair from guides operator, and I'm going to make sure that we are using the hair distribution channel for our UV set. And the final step is to go and edit this actual UVs. So I'm going to go to my UV editor. I'm going to select my eagle. And I'm going to enter the component mode again. We can go to face mode, because we already selected those faces. And we'll find exactly where these faces are. So the problem is right now that these faces are not in a straight line. Instead, they're kind of bent a little bit. And we want to align them along the U-axis to be on the same V coordinate. To do this, I'm going to go to my UV Toolkit Tools dialog here. And first thing is I want to disconnect these faces to be their own shell. So with those faces selected, I'm going to go to this cut and saw dropdown, and I'm just going to create a UV shell here. So I'm pressing the create UV shell, and if I move them now, you can see that they make up a separate shell. And next I'm going to spread those along the U-axis so that they all have the same V coordinate. And to do this, I'm going to go to unfold, and there is this straighten UVs option here, which I'm going to use, and now it has straightened this out into one rectangular shape for me. I can either use automatic layout, or I can scale this manually to be a little bit bigger, and I'll just place them somewhere in the beginning of our UV space here, so that we can have a quick future access to this. So once I've done this, if I go back to my viewport, you can see that our hairs are now much more evenly spaced, and this is exactly what we wanted and what we expect to see. If I go back to hair from guides and reduce the count, we can kind of spread this out to be approximately the same distance or amount as in our reference image. So these are probably a little bit too thin right now. I'm going to go back and turn on my change width operator. I'm going to make sure that we have same thickness throughout our whole feather. And we will be replacing these feathers in the future as with actual propagated feathers. So right now they're just stand-ins, and they're there to give us kind of a visual aid of where the feathers will be placed. So I'm just going to increase the width a little bit. We do want them to overlap each other. So maybe something like this is good. If you notice right now, as I rotate my camera, all of these feathers, they're always facing the camera, because this is the default setting for hairs. We want hairs to be cylindrical, whereas feathers are flat. So we will go to our furball shape over here, which is probably a good time to be renamed to main feathers, main wing feathers. And I'm gonna go to the viewport display dropdown, and in here we have a checkbox called camera facing hair. We want to turn this off. If I turn this off, then we are getting the rotations from the hairs themselves, which are oriented along the topology of our mesh, which happens to be kind of random in places. So that's why we get this weird, strange, random orientations by default. So next thing to do is to go back to edit guides and to start playing around with the shape of our feathers. I'm gonna make sure that the guides are a little bit thicker because right now it's hard to see them. I'm gonna go back to guide options and increase the guide width to maybe 10. You can probably go to a higher value. If I select guides individually and move them around, you can see that we can actually sculpt and create our feather shape. To change the length of it, right now it's constrained. We can go to our guides options here, and we can uncheck this preserve strand length option. Let me just get rid of my UV toolkit. If I do that, I can change the length, and I can pretty much have complete control over the shape of my guides. Again, at the tips of the wings, the guides are their longest, and they get shorter progressively the more we get towards the body of our bird. So you want to make sure that we approximate the shape. We can stress a little bit more about this later. But the good thing is that we can always, like I said, add or remove guides, and this does not affect the positioning of our final hairs. So we can always go back and adjust our guides as needed. So right now, as I said, the rotations are a little bit wacky. So what we can do is we can select all of these guides and go back to our root mode. And we can press this rotate strands button here. And if I click and drag on the surface of the mesh, you can see that we can adjust the rotations of the actual hairs. So what's happening here is that we are actually rotating the guides. We don't see those rotations, but the rotations of the guides are getting interpolated by hair from guides into the final hair. The rotations can be adjusted individually. So if I just select this one guide, I can just change its rotations, and they're going to be interpolated for the other guides. We are all doing it inside the same edit guides operator. However, if you want to separate the shape changes from your rotation changes, you can always create a second edit guide operator and do it there. But just for simplicity's sake, I'm doing it all in a single operator here. So I'm just going to adjust my rotations so the feathers are kind of overlapping themselves, and I just want to make sure that they are going in the right direction. And it looks like, judging by the reference, this is the correct orientation, so they should be overlapping each other this way. So something like this is okay for now. As a final step in this video, let's just duplicate these changes to the other side of the mesh. This is quite easily done in Ornatrix by adding a symmetry operator. So I'm just going to click this add symmetry operator button in the shelf to duplicate the feathers onto the other side of the mesh. So these hairs are actually grounded on the other side of the mesh now, and they can receive surface information, and they will deform accordingly if our eagle is animated or if we perform any other actions on it. We can also uncheck this button to get faster updates. So in this case, they're not grounded, they will not deform with the mesh if the other side changes non-symmetrically, but this is okay for the modeling phase. So if I go back to edit guides and I make any other adjustments to my guides, you can see that the changes will remain symmetrical, and this pretty much saves us half of the work when creating our feathers. So I'll see you in the next tutorial where we will finesse this a little bit more, and we will start converting these placeholders into actual feathers using a feather reference. Thank you for watching.